Our next speaker, Alan Rusbridger, knows something about just how power and influence work and has consistently championed investigative journalism during his tenure as editor of The Guardian. Alan is in an unusually strong position to drive through his ideas and set his agenda for the paper, as he not only sits on the board of Guardian News and Media, but also on the GMG and Scott Trust boards. And if his success in establishing the Guardian's brand around the world is Alan's finest achievement, and its website now has 90 million users, then its investigative reporting, and in particular the NSA files investigation, must rank a close second. Maybe the two are linked. Let's hear now from Alan Rusbridger.
I'm going to the airport to pick up another award, not the Pulitzer, but this is a sort of Screenwriters Guild to the Pulitzer. It's the Polk Award. But what I'll do is to talk, but it would be good to have some questions. So I'll try and be brief in what I say to so that some response. There was a terrible failure of nerve, I think, sometime about 5 years ago. Every newspaper was having a tough time. We were going through, everything went wrong at the same time. There was the transition from print to digital, with all that was tied up in everything we know about the relative values of advertising, coincided with the world economic crash. And it was a sort of perfect storm of things that were really challenging. And I think quite a lot of newspapers made a completely fatal mistake, which was to forget what business they were in and jettison the stuff that seemed difficult and that seemed expensive and troublesome, and where it wasn't apparent that there was a direct link to revenue. And I think one of the things you saw, people closing down foreign bureaus all over the world. The Washington Post, I think, making the wrong decision to shrink from being an international newspaper to a national newspaper to a local newspaper, even closing down national bureaus. And investigative journalism seemed like a thing that had no immediate payback, was difficult, was expensive, and people, I think a lot of people stopped doing it. And we did kind of the obvious. It was obvious. We did kind of the opposite. It was obvious to us, which was to invest in it. And so today I just want to talk about a little about the process, the culture that produces this kind of reporting, and I think why it matters not only editorially but commercially. So if I talk about Edward Snowden, I'd like to go back a bit before Edward Snowden, because these things don't fall into your lap by accident. You make a series of decisions about the kind of news organization that you are, and those decisions, if you're lucky, end up with wonderful stories like Snowden. But the thinking that The Guardian set out on about 4 or 5 years ago, it seemed to us, as we, like everyone else, tried to understand what was happening in these dramatically revolutionized forms of creating and sharing and distributing content, it seemed to us there was a fork in the road between being closed and being open. I'll just use that as shorthand for what I'm talking about. And open to us was a deep interest in what other people were capable of creating themselves, and how information would be shared and linked and move around the world. Other people went in exactly the opposite direction. They thought they wanted to cling to the notion that people sitting in newsrooms were the only people who could create meaningful journalism, and wanted to recreate 19th and 20th century business models around that notion of journalism. I just say that because that decision led to, if you look around the Guardian site, you will see numerous examples of this in action, whether it's in sport, in environment, in travel, in science, Almost everywhere that you look, you will see stuff that has been created by other people or is deeply interested in people who aren't conventional journalists and what they do. And one of those was a man called Glenn Greenwald, who was a blogger. And again, this seems like a bit like history now, but you probably remember there was a time when bloggers were spoken of with a kind of sneering disdain by mainstream media, as though they were saddos in converted garages who hadn't yet got out of their pajamas in the morning. There were sort of subspecies of people who were competing with us proper journalists and not to be taken seriously. We didn't share that view. We thought that bloggers was just a term for people who were writing stuff. And quite often those bloggers were deeply knowledgeable, deeply interesting, sometimes slightly obsessive, with all that's good and bad about that. And the ones who really understood the medium were building up enormous audiences. So by the time we hired Glenn Greenwald, a blogger who does sort of work from his front room in Rio, writing about national security, he had something like a community of 1 million people who were deeply interested in his journalism, and they sort of came with him. And it was quite a difficult thing to negotiate because he had his own terms and conditions for coming to The Guardian. And you just think, I mean, I look now at the New York Times, and the New York Times I know would never have hired Glenn Greenwald. They just wouldn't. But we did. He came, he wrote obsessively about the NSA, about national security, about privacy, and there was a 29-year-old living in Hawaii who was one of his readers who thought, I have a story to tell, and he's the person I can most trust to tell it. And The Guardian is the most open platform, and I will get to 90+ million people through this, and that is deeply interesting to me. Completely uninteresting to go to something that was hidden off behind a wall with a very small audience. They're still on the 19th century model of what information is. So I just explain that in advance because sometimes people say, oh, these stories fall into your lap. Well, they do and they don't. There was, as I say, there were a series of decisions, and one of the papers Edward Snowden was completely clear he was not going to go to is the New York Times. And that's not, I hold the New York Times in huge respect, but the New York Times was never going to trust Glenn Greenwald on a story like this. And in 2005, as you all know probably, when they did get a fantastic story about the NSA from a previous whistleblower, they didn't use it for a year because they couldn't quite decide whether or not to. So that's the sort of prehistory to Snowden. And I won't talk too much about how we got the story. It was an immensely complicated story to do. If you're interested, buy Luke Harding's brilliant book, soon to be a major film, only slightly joking. But it was the way that Snowden initially dealt with this material, and by the time he got to us, it was in different parcels in 4 different countries in 3 different continents. And that, together with the nature of the material, the communications involved, and the reporting that went on, it was easily the most difficult story, ethically, logistically, legally, that any of us had ever handled. It probably involved a dozen people or more in reporting terms and editing terms. It involved more people in terms of technology, in terms of legaling. The legal bills have been very substantial. So in pure accountancy terms, not really worth it. So if you were thinking in sort of 2008, what can we cut? What's worth doing, what's not worth doing? You definitely wouldn't do Edward Snowden. And yet it has had this extraordinary influence, as Rufus was saying. I mean, I can't think of a story quite like it, where a story written that originates in a news organization goes right to the President of the United States, who commissions his reviews. The Congress begin to change laws. It ricochets around the capital cities of the world. The biggest technology companies in the world are demanding meetings with the President of the United States. Some Martin Sorrell, who's about to speak, stands up and says that the advertising industry hasn't begun to appreciate the importance of this story. So it was a story that had deep ramifications. The longer it sort of began as something where people said, oh, it's just privacy versus national security. And then people thought, oh no, it's much bigger than that. It's about international relations. It's about technology. It's about technology companies. It's about private telecom companies. It's about very big, almost philosophical issues about the nature of privacy and of consent, of democratic oversight. It involved highly technological things like cryptology, about the way that the web itself was built, and things that most people hadn't sort of concentrated on or understood or still don't understand, about things like metadata, a sort of dull word to describe something that is revolutionary in its importance, that we understand that. So it was an enormous story, and I think its ramifications will be felt for a long time to come. And in terms of what it said about us, a number of things began to happen. One was quite extraordinary reaction. I've never had a reaction like it from complete strangers. So it's the only time in my life I've been stopped in the street by people or out in the cinema or in the shops. And regularly, it still happens, from people who have no idea, I had no idea who they are, who just come up and shake my hands and say, thank you very much. Can you please keep going at this? Complete strangers sent money to The Guardian. Checks would arrive saying that this is the kind of reporting that we believe in. Daily, sometimes hourly letters of thanks, and letters and emails of thanks. So it was doing something quite extraordinary to a readership that was way beyond the core readership. That's why it always amuses me when people say, oh, the other papers aren't reporting this, people aren't interested. People are deeply interested. People get what this is about. And I've never had a story like this where there has been such a deep emotional response to what we have written. And we absolutely didn't do this because we wanted to build circulation or make money or build audience. But there's no doubt that we have shot through 90 million in terms of unique users a month. And something happened to our circulation, because all print newspapers are on like that at the moment. And something happened where it just pulled out and started to build at the end of the year, despite us putting the price up twice. And I don't think this is because people were buying The Guardian to find with trembling hands what we were writing about Edward Snowden that day. I think something more profound had happened, which was people thought that's what a newspaper should be. And now remember, that's what journalism is about. That's what journalism used to be. That's what journalism should be. So in terms of what it said about the values of a newspaper that was prepared to do this kind of reporting, to put this kind of investment in, to stand up to power, to hold power to account, to tell the truth, to be robust, to defend its journalism in the face of attacks, it was kind of priceless in what it said about The Guardian and what The Guardian wants to be, should be at its best, and I think is. So it was about... And we'd been through this period of Leveson where a lot of people had wondered. There was so many aspects of Leveson were showing journalism at its most toxic or most pointless, and I think this was just a reminder of what journalism could be. And I think the other thing that it did was to say something very profound about The Guardian and its distinctiveness. And that's obviously an incredibly important thing, that we're living in this torrent, ocean of media today, with people doing really interesting things, new startups, new experiments, new tools, and you have to find something which is going to make your brand, your newspaper, stand out. And I think it's not just Snowden, but the kind of journalism that we're doing, people are beginning to recognise that there is something powerfully distinct about The Guardian. But these stories don't arrive overnight. And the thing about the decision that we took about being open rather than closed was a very important part of it. But these things grow out of a culture in which you have people and adjacencies and skills and interests that begin to feed off each other and nourish each other. So that this was a culture which, just some examples of the kind of things that we've done over this is just the last sort of 3 or 4 years. So there was the death of Ian Tomlinson at the G20 meeting in London. Something where the police had one version of events and a reporter didn't believe it. And he used a combination of old-fashioned shoe leather and crowdsourcing to find the evidence that proved that the police were not telling the truth. That led to the trial of the officer concerned. Same reporter, Paul Lewis, did another story involving crowdsourcing of Jimmy Mbenga, the person who was being deported, who died on the plane at the hands of Group 4. That's led to another prosecution. The same reporter, Paul Lewis, and Rob Evans working on Undercover Cops, an extraordinary story of policing and human drama and betrayal involved in Undercover Cops, and which led into the Stephen Lawrence trial as well, and that's led to a public inquiry. There was a 5-year work of Nick Davis over phone hacking, led to a public inquiry, led to a number of trials and reform of regulation. There's the World Cup Qatar slaves, still a huge story with international ramifications. There was the work that David Lee did into British airspace and bungs, led to an SFO inquiry. There was the work that David Lee did on Trafigura and the toxic spills in Africa. Huge payouts and apologies in the end. David Lee's work on tax secrets. David Lee and Nick Davis, their work on WikiLeaks, a huge story of about 3 years ago. Ian Cobain, his work on illegal rendition and torture. Felicity Lawrence, her work on food and how it's produced and what's in it and how it's contaminated and doctored. So I just mention those because what we've created on The Guardian is this corpus of people who can do these kind of stories. They learn from each other. We have legal teams who know how to defend these kind of stories, how to make them safe. There's a kind of osmosis by which reporters learn from each other. There are inevitable PR, social and political consequences of these stories, and you need to be the kind of organisation that is robust enough and resilient enough to be able to handle these kinds of things. And you need to have a management and a board and a trust behind you who say, we are going to be big enough to see that the importance of doing this is beyond the immediate questions of budget. So if you just approach this from a financial sense, and if you were run by people whose primary consideration was financial, you wouldn't do any of this. And you wouldn't have a newspaper that had created an international reputation, because we're doing this in the US, we're doing it in Australia. Kath Viner has done extraordinary stuff around asylum seekers in Australia. So wherever we go, we do it. And we have built up this now international reputation, which fits our international drive, because we have become, whether we like it or not, and we do like it, this globally known organisation now. And people instantly know what kind of paper The Guardian is. So that's in a nutshell, and I'll stop there because I'm sure that we can have some questions before I dash off to the airport. But that's why we do it, because it says something distinctive about The Guardian. because it's important in itself. All these things lead to powerful conclusions and powerful results. That's what journalism is about, and it's been wonderful to be part of an organisation that can lead people to smile and remember what journalism should be.